Our second defense today is by Ms. Madeleine Hernandez, and her thesis statement is, because American culture idealizes extroverted behavior, it is therefore just for individuals to integrate an understanding of introverted behavior in order for society to strive towards virtue instead of an idealized personality trait. Please welcome Madeleine.
Consider this description of a student. He is quiet, thoughtful, attentive, engaged, and a good listener. This student, we'll call him Mark, succeeds in the classroom. Mark is praised for his ability to work with the material and collaborate with his classmates, all while maintaining an introspective, quiet countenance. Mark is considered to be the ideal student, particularly because of these qualities. Because he reaches the culture's idealization of a good student, he feels confident and supported. Now consider the fact that the student described is actually a student in Japan, where the culture idealizes introverted behavior. Let's say, however, that the same student with identical qualities was placed in the American school system. Instead of being praised for his introspective qualities, he is seen as disengaged and unsociable, which discourages Mark and leads to a lack of confidence. In one environment, Mark is the idealized student. In another, he is looked down upon. This situation illustrates the danger that derives from a misunderstanding of personality traits. Because American culture idealizes extroverted behavior, it is therefore just for individuals to integrate an understanding of introverted behavior in order for society to strive toward virtue instead of an idealized personality trait. The favoritism of extroverted behavior in American society is often referred to as the extrovert ideal. It suggests that the ideal citizen ought to be extroverted. Without realizing it, American culture couples the extrovert ideal with virtue. It is essential to note the difference between the two. Virtue, as defined by the Catechism, is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. Extroversion is simply a personality trait which aids description of an individual. Part of the definition of culture is to favor certain values or aspects of a people over others. Therefore, a culture that values extroverted behavior is unproblematic by itself. Think, for example, of French culture, which values leisure. Leisure is a good and healthy thing. However, when leisure is seen as more important than developing a proper work ethic, there is an imbalance in society that can lead to detrimental consequences. An example for this situation, economic jeopardy. This analogy helps to grasp what American society is at risk of. If American culture favors extroverts to the detriment of introverts, society risks polarization between people and a devaluation of true virtue. America's preference for extroversion is not bad. In fact, it is natural. But society must be aware of the slippery slope that is idealization. The balance of American culture is upheld when it strives for justice, one of its founding principles and a cardinal virtue. To treat each individual justly requires adequate knowledge of the individual. This proposed risk to American society is meaningless without first developing a true understanding of introversion and extroversion. Introversion and extroversion were first introduced by Carl Jung, a psychoanalyst in the 1920s. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types, in which he explored the idea of introversion and extroversion. In an excerpt, he describes his observations of these two types, saying, "There are two obvious tendencies that are so drastically different from each other that they cannot be ignored. These two tendencies Jung refers to is the tendency to remain inwards, introversion, or outwards, extroversion." Now, over a century later, these terms are popularly known and used. The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines introversion as an orientation toward the internal private world of oneself and one's inner thoughts and feelings, rather than towards the outer world of people and things. Introverts are relatively more withdrawn, retiring, reserved, quiet, and deliberate. They may tend to mute or guard expression of positive effect. Introverts are those who interpret or respond to the world inwardly or subjectively, as how information relates to them. On the other hand, extroversion is characterized by an orientation of one's interests and energies toward the outer world of people and things, rather than the inner world of subjective experience. Extroverts are relatively outgoing, gregarious, sociable, and openly expressive. Introversion and extroversion are broad personality traits that exist on a scale. Society has forgotten that these are personality traits and alone don't convey virtue or credibility. They simply describe tendency. Therefore, we must develop a true understanding of these terms in order to move forward. Most importantly, introversion and extroversion are tools used to describe behavior. Because our minds and bodies work in tandem, it makes sense that these behavioral patterns are connected to biology. A main difference between introverts and extroverts biologically is that introverts favor a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, whereas extroverts favor dopamine. Acetylcholine is connected to the parasympathetic side of the nervous system, which is nicknamed the rest and digest side. When we engage the parasympathetic side, our body conserves energy and we withdraw from the outer environment. Because introverts favor this neurotransmitter, the parasympathetic side of their body is more often engaged than in the extrovert, therefore explaining the behavioral differences between the bubbly extrovert and the more reserved introvert. This again shows how these are just tendencies, motivating society to recognize that one is not better than the other. One way that we see the idealization of extroversion is in the all-American image. Arnold Hingem, author of A Misunderstood Individual Difference, stated that the all-American image of people is that they should be outgoing, participating, and socially oriented. When someone fails to fit into that mold, he or she is often rejected by others and is forced into a rather lonely existence. In addition to the all-American image, many spheres of American life are observably geared to favor extroverted behavior. Within the home, school settings, and workspace, the extrovert is more easily understood and communicated with. Because the introvert behaves in a way that is not as gregarious as the extrovert, the initial desire to engage with this person may not be as easy, but even more so, it should be strived for. This is because there has been a rise in instant gratification and comfort within American society that must be combated. The extrovert ideal is most clearly seen within the school setting, which favors extroverted students. To start with, the average class size for public elementary schools is 24 students per one teacher. Automatically, the introverted students are generally at a disadvantage. They do not easily speak up and are passed over by the other students, who leave no second to silence and who dominate the conversation, thus discouraging them from speaking even more. Teachers and parents may favor these outgoing children for their sociability and the ease with which they communicate. However, Arnold Hingem says, "Think how devastating it is for an introspective, sensitive person to sense that his parents prefer his sibling to him. If he is also rebuffed in school, his self-concept is further damaged, and he becomes vulnerable to deep-seated personal problems that can severely affect his development." In elementary schools, as well as in college, systems are in place that are geared towards an idealized extroverted students. The risk here is that the extrovert ideal creates the expectation that a good student is one that participates. In reality, a good and virtuous student is one that seeks mastery of the material. The risk is demonstrated in this following study. In this study that researched the correlation between in-class participation and achievement, it was concluded that success rate was directly affected by active participation. Success has commonly been assessed by an instructor-centered rating system, meaning that the focus is completely on the educator, who might strictly lecture and then observe the student's active participation in the classroom. This method relies on objective and observable participation, which the introverted student is not inclined towards. This instructor-centered rating system can prove problematic because participation can appear passive. Particularly for the introverted student, whose comfort level in a stimulating environment, such as a large classroom, is low, the student may refrain from active participation, but can and should participate all the same. The study found that active participation was correlated with higher rates of success. However, these studies were done in an instructor-centered system where the educator more or less failed to engage with his students. Therefore, it is understandable that unless these students participated actively, they would risk failure. This system fails to recognize that statistically half of their students are not inclined to make the first move towards engagement and require an environment that recognizes their needs. When school systems begin to equate true achievement with the mere appearance of participation, the goal of education is lost, and individuals act to serve themselves, straying away from virtue. This study shows more clearly the risk of a society that is geared towards extroverted behavior. Success is not limited to observable contributions or participation, but is found as an interior shift towards the good. Giving light to these issues begs for a solution, a shift towards change. It is reasonable to say that very few of us, myself included, do not have the authority to suggest specific ways that society must change to combat these proposed risks. We don't have the authority to suggest that a teacher must split his or her attention further to cater to the needs of every individual student. That would be unfair and unreasonable. However, the findings of this study motivate an area for change, and the solution can be applied universally. The solution is that each individual must do what is uncomfortable. They must go outside of their comfort zone habitually in order to limit polarization. How can society wish to grow in virtue if it remains complacent in idealizations and comfort? For society to strive towards just treatment of individuals, the individual himself must strive towards what is just and good. For the introverted student, this may look like him answering more questions or speaking up more than what is comfortable. For the extrovert, this may look like refraining from giving one's input at any opportune moment. This is uncomfortable and difficult to do, especially in today's culture, where America's tendency is to do what feels good and not what is good. This proves, however, that the struggle is all the more necessary. Going outside of what is comfortable for both is a step towards change that seeks virtue and does not remain complacent. This measure for change is the best way of striving towards a more balanced society. Each individual is called to transcend comfort and strive towards virtue. Introverts are called to struggle equally as much as extroverts are called to struggle. The risk to our American society calls in particular for justice, for just treatment of individuals. It is only when American society and each of us as individuals takes a step towards this transcendence that interpersonal relations can flourish and we can enjoy the fruits of this struggle. By motivating the solution to these issues, which cause polarization and a lack of virtue, the hope is that when Mark, the introverted, quiet student, is placed in the American school system, he may feel supported, seen, and competent, developing the habit of going outside of himself and flourishing as a result, so that he and his community may reap all the rewards of the struggle for virtue. Thank you.